the goddess Sekhmet for this book. I am the one who knows the way in and the way out. This book introduces a fifth way, the way of the five bodies, as it was in Egypt, but also new knowledge blended with the old to open the fifth way. This book serves the purposes of Sekhmet and humans. It fulfills the need to multiply the images of Sekhmet. All the time is, to me, nothing more than the flick of a cat's whisper. But now is the time for this work. On the night called Sekhmet, all humans will dream the same dream. Then, what do you think they are going to open their eyes to? The cat has been long out of the bag. Humans must now support the new temple of Sekhmet, the fifth way. Then the greatness that once was will become the greatness now, not the same, but as it should be and must be. Sekhmet does bless this work. The way of the five bodies. According to an extremely ancient tradition, distorted variations of which are a part of many religious, spiritual, magical, and occult systems, the human being has five bodies, all interactive, but each one having a dimension or reality in which it lives and functions, and which is of the same substance as that body. These bodies and realms, in order of subtlety, are the most subtle, which is the spiritual body, or called the Egyptian SAHU, and the increasingly less subtle body, which is the magical body, or the Ku, and then the shadow, the HADIT. Next is the double, or the Ka, and then the physical body, or the AUFU. The way of the five bodies requires a consciousness which simultaneously differentiates each of the five, while at the same time all of the five are functionally integrated. There is a metaphysicology and methodology for achieving this ideal, and as well an underlining metaphysic. The way is practical and realizable. Although extraordinarily demanding, it can explain much and lead to accomplishments which would otherwise be impossible. If it is humanly valid, then it is not just Egyptian. Although its known source is the magico-spiritual way of the goddess called Sekhmet by the Egyptians, I will discuss the metaphysic briefly, the metapsychology which can be tested in considerably more detail. According to this way, there are two primordial, coexisting, interactive, absolutely antagonistic realities: cosmos, which is the powers and principles of order, and chaos, the disordered powers and principles. The essentially irrepresentable powers are functionally represented by netters, or beings experienced by humans as gods and goddesses, angels and demons, and others known to religions and mythology. These powers, their principalities, and for us, are hierarchical and, in our terms, good or evil. They are locked in and thus far perpetual struggle, each seeking the other's transformation. They are indestructible, but subject to transformation, so that a final resolution could be transforming of chaos into cosmos, or that of cosmos into chaos. Out of this conflict, sometimes called the war in heaven, has arisen intermediate realities, including the human. The whole reality has substance, but is neither material nor spiritual, and it is more or less subtle in varying degrees. Much of it is altogether inaccessible to and unknowable by humans. Some of it can be glimpsed or revealed, but not participated in by human beings. With an exceedingly narrow sector of the whole of reality is the dimension of the human. The present situation may be very roughly described in the following manner, with references to positioning in space understood as convenience and not essentially veridical. At the bottom is chaos, a realm of such subtlety that it could, if experienced, be misunderstood as void or non-being, also darkness. In terms of the war in heaven, this realm and the existences natural to it are the place and the places of the gods of evil, working with absolute intensity towards the transformation of cosmos into chaos. To human reasoning, the fact of such forces implies itself a kind of order, but that is not true, and the order is a fabrication of mind which cannot grasp the mystery. Primordially, contiguous to the chaos is cosmos, the place and forces of order, good, light, creative harmony, and the cosmic gods. Implacable as chaos, cosmos unwaveringly and with absolute intensity pursues the goal of transformation. Cosmos and chaos are of the same degree of subtlety, and only their subtle substance is completely and eternally real. Yet it is as if there have come to be, in a space between cosmos and chaos, dimensions of being which most fundamentally are the arenas of conflict in which the struggle of the forces take place. These arenas and conflicts and combatants have substance of varying degrees of subtlety, but more fundamentally are the appearances, the imaginal constructs, the functional representations of the essentially irrepresentable powers and principles. The so-called material and spiritual worlds, including human and their worlds, are such appearances and representations, something like particles of mind, temporarily giving differing kinds of existence and, in some instances, degrees of autonomy. These mysteries also go beyond human understanding. Although mystery schools can impart a measure of understanding, what is important to really know and to be fully is to believe is that man and his worlds are not all that they seem to be, that the apparent reality is far more malleable and subject to directed transformation than we are taught, that it is, or as it seems to be, and that these belief systems, which sustain such illusions as immutability and objectivity, are also subject to alteration, all laws of nature amongst them. Above chaos is the created and already imaginal realm of the demonic metaleons, the evil gods, the demons, and other chaotic entities. Correspondingly, below cosmos is the realm of the divine metaleons, gods and goddesses, angels, demons, and others. This realm too is created and imaginal, and it is the metaleodons, whether of cosmos or chaos, which interact directly with human dimensions. A few most potent of these great metaleodons represents the gods of the two primordial realities. Above the realm of the metaleodons of the chaos is the disordered material realm of the subatomic particles, matter, with chaotic, not just unpredictable, positions and velocities. This is the reality which is referred to by the second law of thermodynamics, predictive of the eventual triumph of chaos. Similarly, below the realms of the metaleodons of cosmos, there is a realm of spirit, and equally potent and seemingly irrefutable laws of theology, predictive. This teleology predictive of evolution of consciousness and eventual transformation of matter into spirit. It is also, however, an imaginal realm without true immutable laws, and is part of the transient created arena and space between cosmos and chaos. It is also called the realm of evolutionary order. Next, limiting discussion to humans and their worlds, there are 5 human realities, each of them potentially knowable by man, who is able to participate in them by means of the 5 bodies he or she possesses. These are the gross and subtle bodies encountered in all major spiritual traditions and systems of magic and occultism. The understanding of them is distorted, however, and some systems, for example, subcategorize, while others lump together, thus arriving at 3, 7, 9, or some other number of bodies and their respective realities. The 5 human dimensions or worlds are a midpoint between the realities of chaotic matter and evolutionary spirit. The gross material or physical body, or just physical body, the AUFU, is the body of autonomy and physiology, and it is what most people think when they mean my body. This body, however, has a brain but no mind, and it is therefore not the body of most experience, as will be explained more fully later. The second, more subtle body is the double, or the ka, and it is the body usually experienced by the mind of that body. It is a body image, and it coincides more or less with the AUFU, and its sensations are also images, or more precisely, symbolic representations of an imaginal reality, which it in many ways distorts. This distortion is recognized by psychology, so that some authors speak, for example, of a symbolic coding, or of the actual reality done by the brain or the brain-mind. Quite apart from metaphysics, one can accept that the experience of one's own and other bodies is not immediate, but mediated by the mind, and occurs in the mind, or brain, if one chooses to regard mind as epiphenomenon of brain. As the cause world is more subtle than the AUFU, similarly the third body and world of the shadow, the HADIT, is more subtle than that of the ka. This is a reality ordinarily experienced as altogether mental and mostly unconscious, the world, for example, of most dreams and most images experienced in trance and drug states. It can be a world of either the personal or the collective or transpersonal unconscious, a world that is the source of many works of art, which figures also in other sorts of creativity. Many fail to consider that in, say, the dream world, they have a body which is not the body of everyday experience, and that the dream would also be in a different reality. The dream body and the dream worlds are unfettered by many of the laws which bind the world of the ordinary waking consciousness. As is true of the ka and other subtle bodies, the HADIT is part of the interactive, which is that constellation of the five bodies which is the human being. Therefore, its experiences can affect the others, particularly those inferior in subtlety, but the more subtle bodies also. Such interactions are most strikingly apparent in cases where the unconscious is clearly in the causal relationship with the sickness or healing of the physical body or mind. Once again, this world of experience is well known to psychology. What is not grasped sufficiently, however, is that the world of the HADIT or shadow is equally as real as the objective world, that the body of the HADIT is also equally real, and that the failure to recognize these facts is damaging and severely limiting. The magical body and its world, or the ku, are only rarely consciously experienced, but shape importantly that work of art or myth which the HADIT in its own consciousness lives, and which it imposes on the ka, which in turn lives out the same myth, but almost always unconsciously. These subtler realities, then, very largely determine the fate of the AUFU, including accidents apart, and when and how it will deteriorate and die. In ancient times, when such matters were better understood, the ku was not thought of as magical, but as mago-spiritual. The line between magic and religion being artificial and imposed on human thinking by religions which already had lost much of their awareness and potency. The ku was the second-order reality and work of the magician-priest, only later just of the magician. To live and act out consciously in the ku, it is necessary to undergo a prolonged and very rigorous training. There are brief, spontaneous experiences of it, most often triggered by unusual stress and the restraint alteration of consciousness. Also, in some more primitive societies, shamans, witch doctors, and similar figures still attain to fragmentary knowledge of the ku and thus can generate some paranormal effects, but these fall far short of what is possible. Nevertheless, the importance of the ku, which can serve either cosmos or chaos, is very great. Functioning unconsciously insofar as the less subtle bodies are concerned, it affects them in their worlds quite apart from determining the myth that is lived out. Each person is to some extent unconscious magician, affecting his world, including other persons, by telepathic, psychokinetic, and other means. In some cases, this unconscious magic can be extremely potent. The highest and most subtle body, and the world of the SAHU or spiritual body, which again, more appropriately, should be the magico-spiritual, but of the first order. This is the world of authentic religious experience as it is attained by the rigorous practitioners of spiritual disciplines, the holy men, the saints, the spiritual masters, whatever they may be called in a particular system. In the ancient traditions, the high magician priest was expected to be able to experience and work with the realities of both Kahu and Sahu. Presently, however, spiritual disciplines largely eschew the magical reality, aiming only at passive consciousness of the spiritual one, more rarely spiritual work and interactions with the netters. This limitation is crippling for spiritual development, and the true goal must be complete consciousness. That is, the knowledge and use of all 5 of the bodies and their respective dimensions. Similarly, the magician is crippled if his or her consciousness and work does not extend beyond the Ku. The Sahu is the only human reality which is congenial to the cosmic gods. Although such beings may descend all the way into the realm of the AUFU, which, however, is excremental to them, the gods of chaos ordinarily ascend only to the realm of Ku when a black magic is practiced. However, some of the most potent sometimes invade the Sahu, so that even the holiest of men or women is not secure from them. Also, the most powerful of black magicians can work with metallodons, representing the gods of chaos at this level, thus affecting the most potent evil. This evil can affect the foundation for consciousness, a link between body and mind. At birth, the 5 bodies and the 2 spirits coalesce, a process that begins at the moment of conception but only is complete at the time of the physical birth. Also, at conception, the breath of life, or Sa, must be released and enter in. It is the Sa, or life force, that the gods can draw upon for immortality. When a god chooses to die, he can do so by abstaining from a periodically needed assimilation of Sa. A human who gains access to the Sa by magical means can use it to extend his or her own life. And when a human being of special gifts is conceived, especially one destined to serve cosmos or chaos, forces will contend to ensure or to prevent the infusion of Sa, even though that occurs in the barest instant after fertilization. Cosmos and chaos designate many more such intended children of destiny than ever effectively reach the world. Either the Sa infusion is blocked, the infant is destroyed in the womb at birth, or the person may be removed at any time later on whenever he or she is vulnerable. Despite attempts at protection, it is very rare that such gifted and chosen humans survive to carry out the work assigned to them. Cosmos and chaos are equally merciless in their efforts to eliminate the designates, since even one such person can drastically affect the human race. AUFU, the physical body. The AUFU, as mentioned, is the physical body, with its muscles and bones, blood and internal organs, glandular and nervous systems, the body that anatomists and physiologists describe. Of itself, it is a mechanical thing, a machine which, for all its awesome potentials, is propelled by mechanics, functions, instincts, biological drives, sensations, and a limited number of learned responses and behaviors. It is operated by the brain and nervous system, and for it to exist and to be alive, only minimal brain functions and of a brain of a very small size would be required. This body is human only by the virtue of its unnecessarily large and, for it, quite superficially complex brain, and of course its links with the 4 subtler bodies and souls. The AUFU lacks consciousness in any higher sense of the word, and its functioning is meaningful only to the mind of the Ka, which, without special re-education, misinterprets it as its own behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. The AUFU can sense and it can feel pain and pleasure, but its sensing and feeling are so distorted by the Ka, which transmutes them into its own images, that their actuality is rarely any major portion of the contents of consciousness. The AUFU is thus falsified by the Ka, which in turn is misled into thinking that it freely governs the voluntary functions and actions of the AUFU. This situation can be remedied only if, by appropriate and strenuous means of Ka, if it is taught to differentiate itself from the AUFU and also attains to a sufficiently accurate sensing, internal as well as surface, of the physical body. All of the subtler bodies and their minds have powerful effects upon the AUFU. Their experiences can affect every part of it, and those experiences, when very vivid or prolonged, are not distinguished by the brain from the realities of its own world. The brain then brings about changes in part and functions of the body as if these were responses to the body's own experiences. The HADIT, or shadow, is the only subtle body mind which naturally possesses a good contact with the knowledge of the AUFU, meaning it can positively or negatively affect the physical body with equal facilities. The Ka once had such contact and capacity, but it has long since been lost. The shadow can be understood as being roughly what is usually meant by the unconscious, and appeals can be made to it to alter the AUFU along desired lines. An example of this would be to hypnotize the Ka, so establishing contact with the HADIT, and then suggest to it that it utilize its special knowledge and relation to the body to, say, dispose of a wart or a tumor, or to increase or decrease blood flow to a particular part. Most effective hypnosis is a dialogue between the hypnotist and the shadow, aimed at achieving certain changes in the AUFU, the Ka, or the HADIT itself. The mindless AUFU cannot effectively survive in the contemporary world, and must minimally be tended to and cared for by the Ka, or if the personal Ka is too feeble or deranged by other persons. However, although it is a machine, even the most ordinary of these unused potentials, which are enormous and far in excess of what can be made use of by even the most developed and most knowledgeable person, since it is essential to the life of the whole person, reason would dictate that it would be well cared for and efforts be made to use it well. However, the Ka and the HADIT frequently behave towards it as if the AUFU were their mortal enemy, also as if it were unworthy of being brought into the kind of awareness that would allow its potentials to be much better used. The AUFU, especially its brain, is the essential foundation upon which rests the structure of the whole person, whatever his or her powers may be. Yet it is always in varying degrees badly fed, poorly exercised, little known, and inadequately used, while at the same time it is subjected to abuses which, if done to someone else, would constitute torture and deliberate destruction. No human being can be found who dies a natural death in the sense that his body parts wear out uniformly. The man who dies naturally is self-destroyed, killing himself by means of barely conscious behaviors which are largely products of unconscious processes and non-human forces. The ancient Egyptians, as depicted in their paintings and sculptures, were the only known civilized people displaying an adequate knowledge and regard for the health and well-functioning physical body. The bodies they almost universally depict are graceful and light, well positioned in gravity, able to make use of directed energies which give access to strength in the absence of excessive muscular development. Obviously, the body image is intact. Awareness of body mechanics is present, and mind and body are in harmonious, mutually supportive interaction. Already with the Greeks and in the ancient Far East, although to a lesser degree, art tells us that the sum of these elements were lost or were never present in the first place. With the Egyptians, the AUFU and Ka are differentiated in awareness, integrated in function. Moreover, with them, the HADIT was in a superior, though far from perfected, relation to both AUFU and Ka. Add to this the knowledge and awareness of some persons of the higher subtle bodies as well, making possible interaction with the netters, and one uncovers basic secrets as to why the Egyptian civilization lasted so long and produced so much that even today is unrivaled. The AUFU is a machine operated by its brain under the influence of the subtle bodies in their minds. But it is also a machine within a brain that is influenced from its own and subtle bodies by the non-human forces of cosmos and chaos. These entities are in all of the bodies. Although the bodies become more subtle, they tend to be less congenial to chaos and more congenial to cosmos. At the levels of AUFU and Ka, however, the chaotic entities predominate unless they are more exercised or these bodies seeded with a greater number of their cosmic antagonists, magical, spiritual operations which are part of the work on oneself at the conscious Kahu or Sahu levels. In the Hadit, the antagonistic forces are in most persons better balanced, so that it is an arena of the greatest conflict. This is the middle ground, and on the higher ground, the Kahu and Sahu, the balance shift towards order. Because of the potency of the demons in the gross AUFU, it always sickens and dies much earlier than it might do otherwise. Even conscious work by the Kahu and Sahu can only delay it for an outcome of time. For the same reason, demonic dominance, the Ka, which survives the AUFU rather quickly, degenerates. The Egyptians labored mightily to prevent this degeneration of the Ka, but their efforts could at best only delay it. Chaos in the AUFU works incessantly to achieve its debilitation and death, which cosmos opposes. So long as humans remain at the level of the mechanical AUFU and sleepwalking Ka, just so long will they remain destructive to themselves and to both their subjective and objective realities. To awaken, a major goal of every magical, spiritual, and magico-spiritual system is to break through and out of the level of non-awareness at which one's life is determined through the body's misuse by the unconscious, even unawares and unintelligent use of the AUFU, Ka, and Hadit, which could affect the most remarkable positive changes in humankind. The fulfillment of humanity's potential, however, implies an unaware participation also by Kahu and Sahu bodies integrated with the others. Ka, the body of experience. The term Ka, or double, is instructive. It informs us that the body of the Ka should as closely as possible duplicate the AUFU, so that the body image does not falsify the physical body for the mind, a falsification which through their interactions results in harm to both. At the same time, the Ka must be aware that its body is not the body of the AUFU. The Ka is mind, and its subtle body is a mental body, and the only body it will experience. Nonetheless, it is also a double, so that it, to the extent, acquires self-knowledge which is accurate. It also accurately knows the physical body. The Ka can attain such self-awareness and thus the knowledge of the AUFU only by means of self-exploration. Existing psychophysical methods are available and of great help in such an undertaking. The Ka possesses many capabilities it shares with the other subtle bodies, but not with the AUFU. By cultivating these and by learning it, it provides essential tools and information which the other bodies can and will make use of. If, on the other hand, it does not develop itself and learns inadequately, then the higher bodies will be crippled in their dealings with the Ka's reality, and otherwise as well. The Ka possesses, most importantly, intellect, imagination, will, and the ability to assimilate and integrate knowledge. As the AUFU is basically affected by food, its environment, and its mechanical use, so the Ka is affected by similar factors, but has the ability, wanting in the AUFU, to take some charge of its own development. It can also initiate better contact with the Hadit, making conscious the unconscious, or part of it at least, which actually means integrating itself with the Hadit body and mind. This is as equally necessary a task for the Ka as it is pursuit of knowledge of itself to gain knowledge of the AUFU. Both efforts, when successful, greatly strengthen the Ka and give it much larger autonomy. More importantly, they are the means to the integration of AUFU, Ka, and Hadit, the making conscious of the parts of the unconscious, and the exploration of the unconscious, which must be undertaken by the Ka, means that the Ka must learn to temporarily inhibit almost all of its own mental processes and allow its own field of consciousness to be occupied, as it were, by that of the Hadit. The Ka must become a detached observer of the Hadit's world. Just as the Ka must come to understand that its body is not that of the AUFU, so must this typically egocentric Ka understand that its mind is not that of the Hadit, another error to which it is prone. Neither must the Ka suppose that the Hadit's world and experiences are its worlds and experiences. Only if the Ka thus differentiates and detaches itself can it safely undertake the exploration. Otherwise it may lose its grasp in its own world, and the Ka will also give in to the beings of the Hadit's world, a power over which the detachment and differentiation would prevent. If the Ka, however, avoids such mistakes, it can expand and further liberate itself by making use of the memories which it brings back from the Hadit and then integrates into its own knowledge and understandings. When the Ka has attained the awareness to its body, and by that the means to a knowledge of the AUFU, then it diminishes the power of the body to determine the contents and processes of the Ka's mind. Similarly, by gaining knowledge of the Hadit, the Ka diminishes the power of the unconscious to determine the contents and processes of its mind. This is one major importance to the person when the bodies have not yet been integrated. After integration, the more subtle Hadit uses Ka within the context of that higher unity, within which AUFU, Ka, and Hadit have become effectively one. By all of the subtle bodies, imagination is used as a psychosensory system, and when working as it should, the system gives a symbolic but functionally accurate and effective rendering of the body and its world. In the case of the three highest subtle bodies, imagination is also creative, and for the SAHU and SAHU, imagination gives knowledge of the magico-spiritual realms and becomes a psychospiritual and psychosensory system. In the Ka, however, imagination is psychosensory only, serving to represent to the Ka its reality, which more or less coincides with the AUFU's. That aspect of imagination, which in the case of the more subtle bodies is creative, in the Ka yields only fantasy, something despised and strongly warned against by the esoteric traditions. For the Ka, fantasy is at best wasteful, and often it is more seriously damaging. Fantasy bodies are created which the Ka and the AUFU then may mistake them for their own, and the Ka is impeded in its own major task, which is that of knowing truly its own mind. The Ka must gain knowledge of its body, and therefore the AUFU, and it must differentiate itself from the unconscious. But it must also come to know its own mind, and for this it is necessary to participate in work which does not offer immediate rewards. It involves self-observation, concentration, strengthening the tools of the mind, and controlling its customary aimless meanderings and fantasies. The mind must be provided and come to demand its own proper foods and environments. In the ancient mystery schools, care was taken that this work was made as interesting and rewarding as possible. Nonetheless, most candidates fell away here, lacking discipline to continue. But the mind of the Ka must be strengthened in its world in order to give some of the necessary powers to the other subtle bodies. The Ka of the person who has chosen this way must approach, within the Ka's limits, to do so, the ideal of sound mind in sound body. If it fails, the person can advance no further, and, in the words of Gurdjieff, in the end will die like a dog. Hadit, on the way of the five bodies. The hadit or shadow can roughly be identified with what presently we call the unconscious, including some of the collective unconscious. It is the body in which the unconscious is experienced, and the unconscious is its world. The term shadow properly suggests that in these realities one is coming closer to the human dimension's noumenia. That the hadit's world, or parts of it, is that of the shadows cast by the more essential realities. This is unlike the world of the AUFU or the Ka, which remain closely off from any directed knowledge of essential or higher realities, although they are affected by them. The hadit of a person on this way has the primary task of differentiating itself from the lower bodies while at the same time functionally integrating itself within them. This is always what is meant by integration, and it should never be thought of as a higher body or consciousness assimilates the others. Obviously, they continue to exist, but the interactions of the bodies and their minds are less conflicting as they become more unified. If the person experiences him or herself as an expanded consciousness having to access the unconscious processes, then there has been no true integration. Simultaneous awareness of these three bodies is the criteria. Were it not for the opposing non-human forces on humanity, a near total harmony of the authentically integrated bodies could be established. But neither chaos nor cosmos can accept the unification, leaving one or the other powerless, and thus a complete absence of conflict and unwanted interactions between these three bodies has an ideal never realized. The hadit can see into and otherwise sense into the body of the AUFU and its double, as well as sensing them from the outside. Its own body is very largely self-created, although its choices about this are far from being free. Thus it can immediate and fabricate itself, a body which grossly resembles the AUFU's, and, less authentically still, is able to create approximations to the AUFU's world, both as it actually is, and as it is known to the Ka. The hadit can also create for itself other bodies, taking any form it can imagine. Similarly, it is able to create any world it is able to imagine, and experience that world very fully. It is what the Ka calls an artist, although it creates as a natural part of its functioning. As, say, the AUFU breathes, senses, or excretes. The hadit is hedonistic, and unless the Ka's will has been highly developed, the hadit's will is feeble, rendering its consciousness suggestible. The hadit is, however, far from being just irrational, and its mental powers potentially far exceed those of the Ka. The hadit can best be reached and worked with by altering the consciousness of the Ka so that it no longer is experienced and seemingly ceases to function. When the Ka is thus out of the way, then the personal field of consciousness is occupied by the hadit, which can be dialogued with directly, guided, and taught. It can then be directed to undertake that work on which itself needs to be done before the hadit can know itself and its world sufficiently to function as part of the integrated larger whole, that is, a more fully conscious person. On the way, the hadit's guide or teacher supervises a prolonged, expanding, and deeply exploration of the unconscious, in which the hadit, unlike the Ka, in its exploration, is an active participant, only seldom taking just a spectator role. The hadit is taught to manipulate time so that in its world, weeks, months, and even years of exploration and other work can be accomplished during what are only minutes on the clock, measured world of the Ka. Even so, the unconscious is so vast, and there is so much work to be done, that the effort usually takes years of Ka time to complete. The hadit, as explorer, maps the terrain, experiences, and classifies the flora and fauna, and otherwise expands its knowledge and its world. a world not only vast but incredibly diverse, learning to function in many different ways and in many different situations. It is gradually exposed to experiences which at the start would have been unendurable for it, and which usually it manages to avoid when left unguided. Since extreme pleasures are available in its world, the Hadit is led to experience these to a degree in ways which is rarely known and able to discover for itself in the Hadit. The Hadit is generally too lazy to venture into the depths and extremities of the shadow world. It is satisfied with the blander pleasures near the surface and the center of its world, and thus also avoids the graver dangers. The pleasure is given and the rewards for its efforts and compensates the fear and the pain it also must experience. The guide must maintain the hedonistic Hadit's motivation by seeing to it that the pleasures outweigh the negative experiences. Eventually, the Hadit must confront what previously would have led to panic, madness, even death. Some of this exploration coincides with the Ka's development of the mind. It must be done before the Ka's will has been strengthened to the point that the Hadit is affected and rendered insufficiently suggestible. A delicate balance needs to be maintained so that the Hadit develops its own will and learns to use its other mental powers, unimpeded by the changes of the Ka. When the Hadit's will and the other little-used potentials are strong enough, then the work of the Ka can be completed. The Hadit will then, if the work is done correctly, voluntarily or willingly cooperate in further exploration and self-development. In addition to exploring parts of the unconscious, by no means all, but enough to allow, the work of the higher level of the Kahu, in addition to the developing of its will and learning to make use of the other mental facilities, the Hadit is then taught to use its powers to function constructively in its interactions with the AUFU and the Ka. It's especially taught how not to introduce conflicts and confusions into the conscious mind, and how not to generate negative effects on the physical body. The Hadit also learns how to join in cooperative problem solving with the Ka, thus making the Ka more creative and more intelligent, and it learns to bring about healing and other beneficial changes in both Ka and AUFU. The ability of the unconscious to intervene in these ways in the workings of the conscious mind and to alter the body for good or ill is well established. It does so continuously and is far more decisive in shaping the life of the ordinary person than the conscious mind apart from it ever is. But then, when the unconscious has been made partly conscious and the integration with the lower bodies is achieved, then there is easier and still more potent interaction which becomes possible. Now, however, it can be chosen and intelligently used. The work aims towards a fuller realization of the myth. Finally, the Hadit in its own world lives out a myth or a work of art, imposed on it from both within and without, which begins to unfold during a person's childhood and continues until his or her death. Sometimes the myth appears to change, but this is an illusion. Only when there is integration of Kahu, Sahu, or both can a person truly alter his or her myth, which it may or may not be desirable to do. The myth is the meaning of a person's life, and if made known to him or her prematurely, it can destroy his or her illusion of autonomy and lead to hopelessness. The teacher will typically know what the myth is long before the student knows it, and must decide when to disclose it to the student. It must be disclosed at some point along the way, but only when the student is ready and is going to be able to change it if needed to be. One part of the work at the level of the Kahu is to either choose a new myth or choose to continue with the given one. Then, in either case, there is some real, non-illusory freedom, and the work aims towards a fuller realization of the myth and its constructive or deconstructive potentials. The personal myth has a guiding archetype, and if the myth is to be altered, the archetype must be confronted in the Hadit, and often its symbolic form must be destroyed. If the shadow attempts this battle without having access to the powers of the SAHU, it will almost inevitably fail, and the person will sustain severe, if not fatal, injury. However, if the archetype is constructive so that the myth is also constructive, it can serve the person as an ally and teacher in the HADIT and be safely and usefully worked with, as some psychological, occult, and other approaches to human healing and development do or try to do. However, that the archetype is constructive does not mean that the myth is worthy of the person. It still may need to be changed and allow his or her larger potentials to be realized. The myth lived by the HADIT in this world determines the life of the Ka in its broad outlines and also in many of its details. It can be deduced by observing the Ka and directly observed by making conscious the HADIT and learning how it functions in this world, its behaviors and experiences. But again, in most cases, the myth should remain concealed from the person until he or she is ready to experience the SAHU and its world. Until then, it is unalterable. The person is ready for the SAHU level work when his or her awareness differentiates, simultaneously and with functional integration, the physical body, the conscious mind, and the unconscious, now itself sufficiently in consciousness. Ku, the magical body. Those bodies, Ku and SAHU, which are involved in true magical religious work, can be thought of as the higher unconscious, collective, and personal. The house of life of the ancient Egyptians and other mystery schools aimed at making these bodies conscious and integrating them with the lower bodies. The Ku is made conscious and its powers developed by means we now think of as magical. The SAHU was made conscious and its powers developed by what we now think of as religious or spiritual practices. Actually, it is a question of emphasis, since for both Ku and SAHU, the work combines magical and spiritual elements. When these higher bodies are made conscious, a person lives at once in two different realities. He or she acts in the mundane world of everyday life and also interacts with the netters, participating thereby in their supramundane world. The world of the Ku is essentially a school and a temple. One who has developed to this level of consciousness will, hereafter, have a netter or a god or goddess as his or her primary teacher. If a human teacher has brought the person thus far, that teacher may still assist in the work, but assumes a secondary role. The teacher may also be assisted by the netters, subordinates in the way being taught, by means of his or her open psychospiritual senses accessible when the Ku has made conscious. The pupil is able to participate fully in the realities created for him or her by the teacher. The quality of his or her work will determine whether the Ku remains conscious. It is quite possible to fail in the school, and the higher consciousness is lost, and the Ku world remains in the mind only as a wondrous memory. True ritual and ceremonial magic involving elaborate and potent symbol systems, hekau, the words of power, consciousness, altering sounds, gestures, postures, and sacred movements, means of activating centers and energy centers of the subtle bodies, subtle body diagnosis and healing, methods of attack and defense, metamorphosis and transformation of the bodies, psychospiritual alchemy, philosophy, theology of cosmos and chaos, and ways of interacting with the netters. These are aimed at developing the Ku and enabling it to use its fullest capacities. The magician is taught and learns to function, first of all, exclusively in the Ku world and the Ku body. Later, however, the whole person, the SAHU, at this level of the work accepted, participates so that, for example, the sacred movements, gestures, and postures are executed by the four bodies simultaneously. This furthers integration of the bodies and also makes the work more effective in the worlds of the less subtle bodies. The postures, movements, and other procedures are also used to help lower-level students advance to the higher states of consciousness. In yoga, for example, the consciousness is directed to centers or chakras found only in the Ku and Sahu bodies in the hope that this will activate the subtle centers, a procedure which bears little fruit. The yoga postures or asanas are more efficacious to lay on the foundation for higher development. But yoga, for all its merits, unfortunately survives only in fragments. Too much is missing, and the psychophysical methods of the way are a more complete approach to the mind-body integration and awareness. Moreover, most yoga teaching professes a bias against siddhis, precisely those powers which the Ku must acquire and develop to realize itself and to do the appropriate work, including preparation for integrating Ku and Su. Like the other present-day spiritual disciplines, yoga is focused on attaining to those states of consciousness available at the Sahu level, the Samadhi, Nirvana, and others, and at best only realizes approximations to these since the level of the Ku is inadequately worked with. These disciplines also have forgotten that the siddhis, subject to abuse in the mundane realities, are essential tools for the most important work. Interaction with the netters and participation in the war in heaven, similarity, such states as nirvana, samadhi, cosmic consciousness, enlightenment, are by means by which the Sahu is strengthened to do its greater work. The Ku's magic and the Sahu's spiritual practices are simply psychological, psychophysical, and psychospiritual methods applicable at levels of consciousness, which ordinary psychologies and other modern approaches fail to deal with and typically believe do not exist. Just as many people do not believe in the incredible wealth of the unconscious until they experience it in a trance or drug state, so there is a disbelief in the still more remote and higher reaches of the unconscious until, by appropriate means, these too can be experienced. The disbelief is merely a product of ignorance based on lack of first-hand experience. The work of the Ku makes plain its reality and further enlarges and expands one's awareness of what is. Until this is done, the person is cut off and alienated from his or her own higher self and potentials, and whatever his or her attainments is for practical purposes. This, when it is not realized, this person is for all practical purposes spiritually dead. The person who has integrated physical body, conscious mind, and the HADIT, unconscious, already has advanced far enough to be greatly differentiated from the less developed human. His or her life will be most certainly rich and productive, and he or she will live in close enough proximity to the higher realities that there will be no fear of actual spiritual death or of life losing its meaning. This is not true, sad to say, of the majority of humankind. When there has been no effective work at all, no integration of body and mind, no exploration of the unconscious, then the person sleepwalks through life and is human only in form and potential. In practical fact, he or she is humanoid only, a mechanical unit having just the appearance of a human. If one looked into his or her unrealized potentials, then one would see that the world of the Ku is silent and unmoving, as if it is lifeless. The Ku body lies inert and sleeping as it dreams the essence of the myth that is the meaning of life for that person. The temple and its school stands empty except for this body and what appear to be statues representing certain gods and other beings. This is the latent and waiting world of the body of the person who is cognitively cut off from the higher realities and spiritual forces. The Ku body and world can come intensively and vibrantly, numinously and awfully alive, but only if brought to life by the work. Otherwise, the netters, who might have been the teachers, remain only statuesque representations. The temple and the school remain forever silent as a tomb. If all work on the less subtle bodies is neglected, and if they should be sufficiently misused, then the person does spiritually die, and the Ku no longer even dreams the essence of the myth. With that, the meaning of life is lost altogether, and there is an inner void far more terrible even than that of living in an inane and destructive myth. More, that same life may have to be lived over and over. This is what Gurdjieff may have been teaching at the roots of these ancient Egyptian thoughts, meant when he said that the person who fails to do the work on oneself will perish like a dog. SAHU, the spiritual body. The SAHU's world exists in close proximity to the world of the Netters, more exactly to the realms of the evolutionary order or spirit of the divine medallions represented of the gods and the gods of cosmos. The black magician, by means of his magic, reverses his positioning of bodies and worlds so that his SAHU world is in proximity to the realms of disordered matter and the demonic medallions, representations of evil gods of chaos. Thus there can occur the most complete interactions between the SAHU magician priests or priestesses and the respective forces in which they serve. In the way of the five bodies the Netters interacted with directly at Kahu and Sahu levels are the goddess Sekhmet and the 8 gods and goddesses associated with Sekhmet, as well as the demigods, demons, and other entities. The antagonist is Set, god of chaos, and Set's associated powers and principalities. Some of these forces contend in each of the human dimensions, and they are always present in body and mind, personality and essence of every individual. Only at the higher levels of awareness and work can they be known to some extent for what they are, and can be differentiated from one's own psychophysical and psychospiritual self and be allied with or opposed. The Netters, through their representations, reveal themselves only gradually, first to the Ku and then the Sahu body and its imaginal senses and consciousness. The human must be sufficiently prepared for such contact with the self-declared others, strengthened and otherwise made ready by the progressive work cumulatively affecting every part and aspect of his or her being. There can be brief, approximate experiences of the higher realities in the absence of such preparation. Many people are given intimations, and for them powerful experiences with the forces of which Ku and Sahu do their work. Examples of incursions of paranormal phenomena sufficient to call into question the consensual reality and the grace of religious experience. These are reminders of something beyond the ordinary world. And these are lures which beckon sometimes and impel others towards cognition of that which they hint to, and they can easily be flashingly disclosing the truth behind them. But the undeveloped person can never endure the continuous occurrence of numinous qualities of such manifestations as part of the work of the Ku or the Sahu. The intensity and range of energies, feelings, overpowering otherness, preternatural beauty, grisly horrors, and in the uncanny and awful, dreadful allure of love, wrath, and other aspects of presence of the Netters. The Ku, when its work is sufficiently advanced, receives an initiation and performs operations to make the Sahu conscious. The Sahu's work differentiates it from the Ku and other bodies, and it becomes functionally integrated with them. At the highest work can be accomplished in each of the 5 human dimensions, the realms of the 5 bodies. Not that the work has ever completed or the human potential is ever made fully accessible, but there is an approximation to the ideal which exceeds what could be accomplished by means of any lesser effort. Not just decades, but centuries of work by the integrated 5 bodies would be needed to completely actualize and master the richness of human beings' potentials. The Sahu continues much of the work begun by the Ku and adds this other work which the Ku could not have done. This spiritual body is, above all, an adept of self-regulation movement along the continuum of consciousness, becoming eventually able to experience states of consciousness which otherwise could only be given by the Netters. Foremost among these is what some schools call Kundalini, an energy system which, in the Egyptian metapsychology, is identified with the goddess Sekhmet. By raising Kundalini, which only the Sahu can do, although lower bodies counterfeit this experience, The brain of the physical body is altered and much more of it comes into use, increasing the powers of all the bodies. When the SAHU, if proper work is done, can acquire Sekhmet, or the power or might. Sekhmet is the most formidable of the human potentials and allows its conscious processor to function both in the human dimension and in the interaction with the netters in ways that would, if they were known, appear superhuman to non-initiates. The SAHU body, when not deliberately altered, is transparent and luminous so that its symbolic centers and energy systems can be clean and clearly seen. Like its world, it is of the subtlest substance and be found in the dimensions of the human, and thus the soul, or the Ba, is in the SAHU body. This extreme subtlety allows the SAHU to be dissolved into and merge with the substance of this world. This is the authentic mystical experience. Again, there are counterfeits and approximations, which some religious and spiritual disciplines misinterpret as the merging of the divine substance, God, or ground of being. It is not that, but it is a powerful and sometimes transformative experience. After dissolution of the body, may reorganize in a way that is superior in its previous organization, affecting not only that of the SAHU, but one or more of the other bodies also. The authentic mystical experience is of itself beneficial and is one aspect of the psychospiritual alchemy, practiced by the Ku and SAHU to the end that the radical transformation of the person is achieved. Higher integration is greater subtlety in each of the lower bodies. The SAHU is also directly moved into the other states of consciousness and realms of experience described in the literatures of various world religions. These include what we now know as Samadhi, Nirvana, Satori, and many others which also strengthen the SAHU and further both its works in the world and with the netters. Such experiences, when not misunderstood, not regarded, for example, as ends in themselves, then can give to larger perspective on reality and to help break down limiting self-beliefs and belief systems. Further, the psychospiritual alchemical process can yield other benefits. The efforts required to attain to these experiences do, however, expose the SAHU and the whole person to suffering and dangers, at least some of which are unavoidable. The so-called dark night of the soul and various other experiences of dread, despair, confusion, and sickness of body and mind in one or more of the bodies, although in fact not in the soul, are examples. Yet these two, assuming they are overcome, will strengthen the person. Stand at one time on 5 worlds at once. The SAHU can perceive, although not enter into, the non-human realms of evolutionary order and the disordered particles of those of the divine and demonic metallodons. Ku and even HADIT are sometimes given visions of these, but the SAHU can choose to perceive them with all its senses and, interacting upon its intelligence, strengthen its love for the cosmos and or chaos, and its abhorrence against the antagonist, by means of its perceptions of them. We speak of the SAHU as doing these things when it has not yet achieved integration with the other 4 bodies. Subsequent to integration, it is the person who acts, although he or she still does so in one of the other 5 human dimensions. In this case, the SAHU world, despite the extravagant claims made by some religions, the human being never goes beyond the human dimensions and could not survive contact even with the appearances or representations of the netters in their far more subtle worlds. To speak of direct and immediate knowledge of God or the divine is a gross absurdity and born at best of ignorance and self-delusion. After the differentiation integration of the 5 bodies has been fully achieved, the priest or magician priest continues learning and other work, advancing through the hierarchy to whatever levels of initiation he or she will ultimately reach. He or she may work mainly in the world, possibly as a teacher, or in some mundane position where his magico-spiritual powers can exert useful influence, business, politics, communications, whatever he or she may work. It will most entirely be with the netters, doing the so-called inner work, in many cases, unless he or she is to be otherwise instructed. The magician or priest or priestess will work secretly. Those close to the person may have some inkling of what he or she does, but it will not be a public work. An occasional teacher, or far more rarely a designated exemplar, will be the sole exceptions. If human beings were not sleeping, they would recognize at once the person well advanced in the work. That they do not notice this, though, that they do not is a helpful safeguard, in which, however, it is the work's purpose to eventually remove. The search for the real school and the Ku and Sahu level teacher is made much more difficult by the fact that those advanced in the work do it quietly and almost always secretly. Further, there are always many false claimants to the knowledge of the work, and others who are also so self-deluded that they actually suppose themselves to have the knowledge. For every utmost authentic teacher, there are thousands of others, and millions to believe themselves to be so until they are proved to be empty. There are a few guidelines that can aid in recognizing real teachers. Such a man or woman can be known, for example, by the conscious manner in which he or she lives out the profound and powerful myth or work of their art chosen. The criteria just mentioned would exclude such powerful but somnambulistic magicians. The integration of the 4 or 5 bodies will invest the teacher with recognizable presence and force. Even if one is only slightly self-absorbent, it can be recognized that one's consciousness alters when in contact with a teacher. One is affected in a way that is obviously different. One may go into trance or awaken or experience other altered states, and the teacher will not, as others do, speak to the ka of a person, but rather to the hadit, not to the conscious mind, but rather to the unconscious. And the teacher can also speak directly to the AUFU, to its brain and its nervous systems, or to the physical body as a whole, thus producing important beneficial or destructive changes in it. This is teaching. It gives pain as well as pleasure, forcing into consciousness various contents which can be repressed or otherwise excluded. It exposes limits to freedom and to growth, and it stirs a hunger for something more. One can give some of these powers to false teachers, but at a cost to oneself, and that self-observation can detect. The authentic teacher may accept or take power from others, but he or she, at the appropriate time, returns much more than was given or taken. One who meets such criteria may be a teacher, but those who are searching should pursue the matter further. One must also find a way to determine whether it is a cosmos or chaos that he or she serves, and choose according to one's predication. Above all, do not expect perfection, but heed that the scripture which says it is nowhere to be found. The highly developed human will be found to have large faults accompanying great virtues. This is inevitable in one who has become larger than life. Nor should one expect perfection even from the gods, which would mean being foolish enough to judge such beings as the netters by human standards. The Egyptian metapsychology set forth in the ways of the 5 bodies brings the aspirant to levels, those of the Ku and Sahu, where the teachings is done not by humans but by the netters, and primarily by the goddess Sekhmet. As the Egyptians recognized, no human teacher, however remarkable, can carry the work into the higher realities, where it can only be effectively done when in interaction with beings whose grasp extends beyond the human. There are other ways of making Ku and Sahu, although not both, particularly conscious, and which thereby give powers, sometimes formidable power, but the magical, occult, or spiritual path which stops short of effecting working with the higher force is inadequate. The person remains but a pawn in the war in heaven and cannot effectively work for humanity's necessary transformation. He or she will lack essential protection and guidance and will commit many foolish and dangerous mistakes. For these reasons, the metapsychology speaks with both compassion and harshness of magical or spiritual disciplines done without the guidance of the netters as the path of fools.